Eugene Calloway had walked Route 9 every morning for 61 days. He knew the exact number because he had started counting on the morning his truck gave out sitting in the driveway with its front end up on borrowed jack stands and a throw-out bearing that had finally quit after years of threatening to. He had stood in that driveway in the thin October light and looked at the truck and looked at his wallet and understood with the quiet clarity that comes to a man when he has run out of road in every direction at once that the truck was going to stay exactly where it was for a good while longer. So he walked. Route 9 was not a bad road to walk if you had the knees for it. Gene's knees had strong opinions about the matter delivered in a low grinding language that started around the half-mile mark and grew more emphatic as the morning wore on. But the road itself was honest. Flat stretches of cracked asphalt running between bare November fields, tree lines thin and gray at this time of year, the sky the color of old pewter most mornings, an occasional car, an occasional truck, the smell of cold air and turned earth, and closer to town wood smoke from houses set back off the road. He walked to the mailbox. He walked to town when he needed to. He walked to the small market on Cedar Street that had been there since before Gene could remember where Lou Atkins ran the register, with the same expression he'd had for 40 years, somewhere between boredom and mild suspicion. Gene bought what he needed and walked back. 4 miles round trip. His knees complained the whole way home. He was 71 years old, and he walked because he had no other choice, and because stopping was the one thing he could not afford to do. Eleanor had been gone for 18 months. He tried not to think about that number the way he tried not to think about the other numbers, the ones that arrived in envelopes and sat on his kitchen table in small, neat, devastating stacks. The medical bills had come first, the long tale of Eleanor's illness, 2 years of hospitals and treatments, and the cruelty of hope stretched out and then withdrawn. The savings had gone the way savings go when a man is fighting something he cannot outspend. Quietly then, quickly, then completely. The house had been paid off once long ago, and then it hadn't been because there had been a second mortgage taken out in the worst of it, when bills were coming faster than anything else, and now there were payments due that Gene was behind on for the better part of 6 months. The house was the thing. The house on Route 9 that he and Eleanor had moved into when they were 31 years old, and newly married enough that everything still felt a little surprising. The house where they had raised 2 kids who were grown now and living their own lives in other states. The house where Eleanor had put in a kitchen garden every spring for 39 years, where she had painted the trim herself twice and argued with Gene about the color the third time until he gave in because he always gave in and she was always right. The house that still held her in every room. The afternoon light coming through the kitchen window at a specific angle she had always called the best light in the house. The coffee mug she'd bought at a roadside stand in Tennessee that Gene washed carefully every morning and set back on the second shelf without using. He was not going to lose that house. He had told himself that every morning of the 61 days he had walked this road, and some mornings he believed it more than others. The frost was still on the gravel when he found the wallet. It was the 58th morning of his walking a Thursday in late November, cold enough that his breath came in small white clouds, and the puddles along the roadside had gone hard at the edges overnight. He was moving at his usual pace, careful and deliberate, watching the ground, because the gravel was uneven out here past the Alderman property, and a turned ankle was something he could not afford in any sense of the word. He almost walked past it. It was the color that caught him, the brown of old leather against the gray-white of frost-covered gravel, tucked half into the verge where the road met the ditch. His eyes found it and moved on before his brain registered what it was, and then he stopped and looked back. A wallet. He stood there a moment. His knees weighed in immediately on the question of bending down. He told them to wait and bent down anyway, slowly, one hand going to his knee for balance, and picked it up. Heavier than he expected. A man's wallet, brown leather, worn soft at the corners from years of back pocket carrying. He turned it over in his hands. No name on the outside, nothing to identify it from the outside at all. He stood up slowly, his knees filing their formal complaint, and looked up and down Route 9. Empty in both directions. No car pulled over. No one standing on the roadside looking for something lost. Just the cold and the empty fields and the gray sky going on in every direction. He put the wallet in his coat pocket and walked on. He did not open it until he was back at his kitchen table with his coffee made and the morning light coming through the window falling across the table at that angle Eleanor had always loved. He set the wallet on the table and sat down across from it and drank half his coffee first. Then he opened it. The money was the first thing. A folded stack of bills, crisp and dense with weight to it when he picked it up, which Gene did slowly and counted with the care of a man who has not handled this kind of money in a long time. 40s and hundreds mixed together, adding up to more than Gene had seen in one place in 3 hard years. $4,200 exactly. He set it down. He sat with that number for a moment because it had a meaning that landed on him like something physical. He was behind 6 months on the house payments. The figure Dale Royce's people had sent in the last notice, the figure that stood between Gene Calloway and losing the only home he had left, was $4,300. He had found on the side of the road almost exactly the money that stood between him and losing everything. He sat with that for another moment. Then he found the driver's license, tucked into the card slot behind the money. Gene drew it out and looked at it. A man's face somewhere in his 50s, dark beard, dark eyes, a face that had seen weather and kept its own counsel. The name on the license was Wade Merritt. The address listed was a rural route number out past the county line, a good 20 miles from Gene's front door. Gene turned the wallet over in his hands, looking more carefully now, and saw what he had not noticed at first because he had not been looking for it. On the inner face of the front flap, pressed into the leather itself, faint but unmistakable. A patch logo. A death's head. The words Iron Covenant arched above and below it. Gene set the wallet down on the table. He knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name, the way you know something you are careful not to get near. The Iron Covenant MC had been operating out of a place past the county line for the better part of 15 years, and the stories about them were the kind told in lowered voices at the diner and the Legion Hall stories that may have been half myth by the time they reached Gene's ears, but that agreed on the essential point: these were not men you wanted business with. He looked at the wallet. He looked at the money. He drank the rest of his coffee. He did not touch the money again that morning. The day went on, the way days go. He did what needed doing around the house, which was not much because the house was small, and Gene was orderly by nature, 40 years as a diesel mechanic, having given him a precise relationship with the placement of tools and the importance of putting things back where they belonged. He ate lunch. He tried not to think about the wallet, which is not the same thing as not thinking about it. Trying not to think about $4,200 on your kitchen table is like trying not to think about a stone in your shoe. The wallet sat on the table all day. That night he moved it to the counter so he would not have to look at it while he ate dinner, then moved it back before bed because he did not want it out of his sight. That told him something about where his thinking was going that he did not particularly want to examine. He slept badly. The next morning he walked Route 9 again out of habit and necessity, and when he came home the wallet was there on the table, the same as he had left it. He made his coffee and sat across from it, and they regarded each other for a while. His neighbor from 2 properties down came by mid-morning. Court Halsey, a man in his early 60s still working, drove a truck Gene had helped him fix twice over the years, back when Gene's knees let him get under a vehicle. Court had been checking in since Eleanor died, not intrusively, just present the way good neighbors are stopping by to say he was going to the hardware store. Did Gene need anything? Gene did not tell Court about the wallet. He sat at that table through the second day and the third day, and the wallet sat with him, and he turned the problem over. The way he had always turned mechanical problems over, methodically, looking at it from each angle until the shape of the thing became clear. The angle that presented itself most clearly and most often was a simple one. The money was found money. Nobody had seen him find it. Nobody knew he had it. The man who had lost it was, by every account Gene had ever heard, a man with resources and connections that did not include a particular shortage of cash. $4,200 to Wade Merritt of the Iron Covenant MC was likely not what $4,200 was to Gene Calloway of Route 9, with 6 months of back payments due and a foreclosure notice on his kitchen counter. He thought about Eleanor's garden. He thought about the coffee mug on the second shelf. He thought about Dale Royce, who had shown up at Jean's door 3 times now, with that smile men wear when they are offering you something with one hand while reaching for your wallet with the other. Friendly visits, reasonable offers. Royce called them for the property, for the land, and the house together offers that were not reasonable at all, that were lowball by any measure, the kind of offer you make to a man you believe is running out of time and options. Each visit, the smile had gotten a little tighter and the friendliness a little more pointed. Dale Royce wanted Jean's house, had wanted it for 2 years since before Eleanor had even passed, and had been patient about it the way a predator is patient when it knows the conditions are moving in its favor. Jean thought about all of that, and then on the evening of the third day, he sat down at the table and picked up the wallet one more time and went through it the way you go through a thing when you are finally ready to see all of it. The money was there same as before, the license, a single credit card, the kind with a low limit and a lot of use, a folded receipt too worn to read. And then his fingers found something he had missed the first time, because it was not where you looked, not in the card slots or the bill compartment, but in a narrow pocket behind the main compartment sewn into the leather itself, the kind of place a man puts what he carries but cannot afford to lose. His fingers found a thickness there. He worked it out carefully. A photograph. Small, worn, the surface gone soft and slightly tacky at the edges from years of handling. The colors faded the way colors fade when a picture has been taken out and looked at so many times that the light has been wearing it down. A young man, 20 or so, dark eyes, a grin that took up most of his face, standing in front of a motorcycle in a sunlit yard. The kind of grin that belongs to someone who does not yet know what is coming. The kind that makes you glad for him and sad at the same time. Folded around the photograph, a small piece of paper, handwritten, the ink faded to gray in places. Jean unfolded it carefully. For Riley Stone. Don't spend this. He read it twice. He sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. The money was not spending money. It was not the man's rainy day fund or his pocket cash or something he would shrug about losing. It was set aside deliberately, carefully, for a purpose written in a hand that had taken care with it. For Riley Stone. Jean thought about the young man in the photograph, that big, unguarded grin. He thought about what it meant that the money was still unspent, still carried in a wallet instead of sitting in whatever account it belonged in, carried close the way you carry something you are not finished with yet. He thought about Eleanor's headstone, which he had bought on a payment plan and finished paying for 4 months ago, and how he had stood in front of it on a cold January morning and felt the strange mix of grief and relief that comes from knowing you have done the one last thing you could do. He put the photograph and the note back in the pocket where they had been. He folded the wallet closed. He sat there in his kitchen for a while longer, thinking about what kind of man he was, and what kind of man Eleanor had believed him to be, and whether those two things were still the same. He already knew what he was going to do. He thought maybe he had known since the first morning. But knowing a thing and being ready to do it are not always the same moment. He was ready now. The next morning he called Court Halsey. He did not explain, not really, just asked if Court could take him somewhere out past the county line. Court said, sure, what time? And Jean said, whenever you're ready. And Court came over at 8:30 with a thermos of coffee in the easy manner of a man who does not ask more than he needs to. They rode out on Route 9, going east past the Alderman property and past the spot where Jean had found the wallet, just a stretch of road like any other now, and on past the county line where the land flattened out and the farms gave way to stretches of scrub pine and back roads that did not show up on most people's maps. Jean gave directions off the address on the license reading from the piece of paper he had written them on that morning, turn by turn, and Court followed without question until the road bent around a stand of pine and the place came into view. Court's hands went a little tighter on the wheel. It sat back off the road behind a chain-link fence, low and long, built of cinder block that had gone gray over 40 winters, a flat roof, small windows set high in the walls. Out front behind the fence, a row of motorcycles stood in the thin morning light. Chrome and steel, 9 or 10 of them, aligned with a precision that was not accidental. each one angled exactly like the last. Court did not say anything for a moment. He read the sign on the fence. He looked at the motorcycles. Then he looked at Gene. Gene had spent 40 years as a diesel mechanic. He had learned to read engines the way some men read faces, listening for what they were saying, underneath what they appeared to be doing. He knew when something was straining and when it was running clean. Looking at that row of motorcycles through Court's windshield, he did not see what the town would have told him to see. He saw maintenance. Every bike clean, every chrome surface tended. Machines cared for by people who understood that caring for a thing is a form of respect for it. Court cleared his throat. Gene, he said. He did not add anything to that. I know, Gene said. You want to tell me what this is about? Gene reached into his coat pocket and touched the wallet there. I found something that belongs to someone here, he said. I'm returning it. Court looked at the fence, at the motorcycles, at the door of the building which was closed and gave nothing away. I'll wait, Court said. Gene understood that was the most generous thing the man could have offered. Gene got down from the truck. His knees registered the cold and the drop from the running board and offered their usual commentary. He put his hand on the door of the truck for just a moment, steadying himself, then let go and turned toward the gate. The lot between the fence and the door was maybe 40 feet across. Gene had walked Route 9 for 61 mornings on these knees. 40 feet was nothing. It felt like a long way. He could feel the space around him the way you feel it when you know you are being watched, that attention, with a physical quality, a weight at the back of the neck. The chain-link fence made a low sound in the wind. Somewhere inside the building, very faintly, a radio playing. Impossible to make out through the cinder block. He reached the door. He stood there and thought about Eleanor. Not a particular memory, just her presence. The specific gravity of a person you have lived 40 years, beside the way their absence reshapes the space they used to fill. He thought about the night near the end when she had held his hand and made him promise. Her hand had been so small by then. He could still feel the weight of it. He raised his fist and knocked. The silence after was absolute, or seemed that way. He could hear his own heart, which had something urgent to say. He could hear his own breathing. The wind moved through the fence. The radio inside went quiet. He was about to knock again when he heard it. The heavy slide of a deadbolt, a bar lifting, and then the door opened. The man who filled the doorway was the largest man Eugene Calloway had ever stood in front of. Not tall in the way of men who are simply tall, but broad-built through the chest and shoulders, the way men are built when they have been physical their whole lives. A dark beard threaded with gray that reached the middle of his chest. Forearms showing below rolled sleeves roped with muscle and marked with ink. Eyes that were dark and still and gave Gene absolutely nothing to hold on to. On the front of his vest, over the left side of his chest, a name in worn thread. Merritt. And below the name in smaller letters, Bishop. Wade Merritt looked down at Gene Calloway standing on his doorstep, this gray-haired old man in a worn coat, and his face said nothing at all. Behind him, Gene could see the dim interior of the room and movement in it. Other men rising from chairs or turning from where they stood, each of them orienting toward the door, the way men orient toward an unknown when they spend their lives being careful about unknowns. The radio was off. The room was very quiet. "Help you," Wade Merritt said. It was not a question, and it did not sound like help was on offer. From somewhere behind him, a voice Gene could not see. "You lost, old man." And another, "Somebody send you out here." Gene's mouth had gone dry. He understood what he looked like to the men in that room. A stranger, no vehicle, no introduction, at a door that strangers did not show up at. There were no innocent explanations for that, not in the world these men lived in. They had braced for every version of trouble. They were braced right now. He had about 2 seconds. He did not try to explain. He reached into his coat pocket slowly with care, the way you move your hands when hands are being watched, and he drew out the wallet and held it up between them, open in the air. Something changed. Wade Merritt's eyes dropped to the wallet and stayed there. His right hand moved without thinking to his back pocket and found it empty. Gene watched that register on the big man's face. He had not even known it was gone. "I found this," Gene said. His voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. On the shoulder of Route 9, 3 days back. Your name is on the license. The money's all there. I didn't take a thing. Wade Merritt looked at the wallet for a long moment, then at Gene, then back at the wallet. The men behind him were doing the same arithmetic Gene could see the big man working through, because what stood on their doorstep was not what they had braced for. They had braced for a problem, a threat, a message a man sent by someone they had crossed. The full weight of their wariness was loaded and ready. What stood on their doorstep instead was an old man empty-handed except for the thing he had come to return. Wade Merritt reached out and took the wallet. His hand was large enough that the wallet nearly disappeared in it, and his fingers were careful with it in a way that did not match their size. He opened it. He counted the bills quickly, a man who counts from long habit. Then he stopped. He had found the inner pocket. His thumb pressed against the hidden compartment, and Gene watched his face change a slight thing. Almost nothing but real. The big man's thumb worked the pocket open and drew out the photograph and the folded note, and for a moment he simply stood there holding them, the room behind him absolutely still. He unfolded the note. He read it. He looked at the photograph for a long time. When Wade Merritt looked up, his face was different. Not soft exactly, more like the dropping of a great weight. His eyes were wet, and he did not seem to notice or care. "You didn't take this out," he said. Not an accusation. A thing he was establishing carefully because it mattered. "No," Gene said. "You didn't look at it." "It wasn't mine to look at." The big man was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the photograph so Gene could see it. The young man with the dark eyes and the big, unguarded grin standing in the sunlit yard. "His name was Riley," Wade Merritt said. His voice had dropped to something very quiet. "My son, we lost him 3 years ago come September." The room behind him said nothing. Nobody moved. "I've been putting that money aside little at a time," he went on, his eyes moving from the cash to the photograph. "Going on a year now. Boy's still out there under a numbered marker because I never had it all at once." He stopped. He looked at the old man on his doorstep, the old man who had walked 20 miles on bad knees to give back money he desperately needed to buy a headstone for a son he had never known. Something passed across that hard face that was almost bewilderment. "You walked up to this door," he said slowly, "knowing whose door it was." "Yes," Gene said. Wade Merritt looked at him for a long moment. This old man in his worn coat standing in the cold without a vehicle, without backup, without anything except what he had come to give back. "Come inside," he said, and this time when the door opened wider, it was not a barrier. It was an invitation. The inside of the Iron Covenant clubhouse was nothing like the place Gene had built in his mind during that walk across the lot. He had constructed it from rumors and secondhand stories, the way you construct a picture of something you have never seen but have always been warned about. Dark, threatening, a place where bad decisions went to become permanent. He had built it from the lowered voices at the diner and the careful way people changed the subject when the name came up. What he walked into was warm. Not just in temperature, though. A wood stove in the corner was pushing out steady heat against the November cold. Warm in the way rooms get when they have been lived in for a long time by people who belong in them. Old heavy furniture, a long couch with a blanket folded over one armchairs, shaped to the people who sat in them, a scarred wooden bar along one wall with a coffee maker running behind it. The smell of that coffee mixing with wood smoke and machine oil and something else, the particular smell of a place that belongs to men who spend real time together. Photographs on the walls, not what Gene would have expected. Long roads and open sky. Men with their arms around each other at rallies, at campsites, on mountain passes, with views that went on forever. And there behind the bar, the thing that stopped Gene for just a moment when he saw it. Children's drawings, crayon and marker on construction paper, suns and stick figures and horses that might have been dogs, taped up with the careful pride of a man who put them where he would see them every day. The men in the room were watching him. 6 or 7 of them, some seated and some standing, all carrying that quality of stillness That is not relaxation, but its opposite, a readiness held in check. They ranged from mid-30s to well past 60. A couple wore their vests with the club patch on the back. Others were in plain work clothes. One man had a forearm in a brace. Another wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. They looked like men. That was the thing Jean would think about later. Not the thing the town had made of them in its imagination. Just men weathered and watchful with coffee cups and photographs on the walls and their children's drawings taped behind the bar. Wade Merritt moved to the bar and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. He set them both down and pulled out a stool and nodded at it, and Jean climbed up, grateful to be off his feet. For a moment, nobody spoke. The men in the room resettled themselves, the recalibration of people who had been braced for one thing and gotten another, and the energy shifted from wariness to something Jean did not have a precise word for. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity, genuine and undefended. Bishop wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at Jean across the bar. "Wade Merritt," he said. "People call me Bishop." "Eugene Calloway," Jean said. "People call me Jean." Bishop nodded once. His watchfulness had not left, but the quality of it had changed. He was no longer watching Jean for threat. He was watching him the way you watch something you are trying to understand. "You're a mechanic," said a voice from the room. Jean looked over. The man who had spoken was leaning against the far wall somewhere in his late 40s, a square face with a jaw that looked like it had been put to structural use more than once. He nodded at Jean's hands. "Hands," he said simply. Jean looked down at his own hands on the bar. 40 years of diesel work had left their mark. The knuckles thickened the skin of the palms, mapped with old grease, and healed cuts the nails that grew back slightly wrong from being caught under things. "Diesel," Jean said. "Retired." The man straightened slightly. "Griff Bauer, I run Cedar Auto down off Route 12. Jean knew the shop, had driven past it 100 times. "You ever work on a Series 60 Detroit?" Griff asked, and that was the beginning of it. There is a language that men who work on engines speak to each other. It has nothing to do with where they come from, or what they have done, or what name is on the fence outside. It is a language of torque and timing, of the personalities of old engines, the ones that ran forever if you knew them, and killed you if you did not, of the deep satisfaction of a broken thing made to run again. Jean had spoken it his whole working life, and had not spoken it with anyone since he retired, had not really spoken much of anything, with much of anyone in 18 months of walking Route 9 alone. He and Griff Bauer found each other in that language within 4 minutes, and the rest of the room let them, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the transmission rebuild, Griff was halfway through on a 94. Kenworth Jean felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was clenched. He was laughing. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that catches you before you know it's coming. One of the other men had joined the conversation, a man named Ray, who had spent 22 years driving long haul before his hip gave out, and Ray had a story about a breakdown outside Amarillo involving a Series 60 and a repair performed with a wire coat hanger and considerable optimism. And Jean laughed at the end of it, and it was the first time he had laughed since Eleanor. He registered that fact quietly in the back of his mind, then set it aside and let himself stay in the room. Bishop watched all of this from the end of the bar. He did not join the conversation. He refilled Jean's coffee without being asked and leaned with one elbow on the bar, the photograph face up in front of him, his thumb moving over its edge now and then without seeming to know it was doing it. It was Griff who noticed first. He glanced out the window, then back at Jean with a slight frown. "You said a neighbor dropped you." "Cord Halsey, my neighbor, he waited, but I told him to go on." "So you've got no vehicle out there?" "No." Griff looked at Bishop. Bishop was already watching Jean with that same steady attention. "My truck's been down for 2 months, Jean said. He turned his cup in his hands. "Throw out bearing and the clutch with it. It's not much of a repair, but not much is more than I've got going at the moment." He said it lightly, the way men say heavy things when they mean to move past them. The room went slightly quieter. Bishop set his cup down. A man your age walking Route 9 every morning. He said, his voice careful the way a big man's voice gets careful when he is picking up something fragile. Because his truck's been dead 2 months. He shook his head slowly. And you found my wallet on the side of that road. All that cash. He paused. And you brought it back. Jean did not answer. There was not much to add to it. What kind of trouble are you in, Jean? Bishop said. Jean had not come here to talk about his trouble. He had come to return a wallet and go home. But he was sitting in this warm room with a cup of coffee in his hands, and there were men around him looking at him with something that was not pity, which he could not have tolerated, but was closer to the recognition of one man for another. And the words came out of him the way water comes out of cracked ground when the conditions are finally right. He told them about Eleanor first, about the illness and the 2 years of fighting it and what that fight had cost. Not in the sentimental way, but in the practical way, the way a mechanic talks about damage, the specific systems that had failed, and in what order. The savings first, then the retirement account, then the second mortgage on the house, because there had been a stretch where the hospital required payment before they would schedule the next treatment. And he had not told Eleanor about the mortgage because she would have told him not to do it. And he had done it anyway because there was no version of that situation where he did not. And then she was gone, and the bills kept arriving, and the payments on the second mortgage fell behind, and a man named Dale Royce had started showing up. The room changed when he said that name. Not a loud change. Nobody moved dramatically or said anything sharp. But Jean felt it the way you feel a temperature drop, something in the air becoming denser. Griff Bauer set his cup down with a sound that was slightly more deliberate than necessary. The man with the reading glasses took them off his forehead and put them in his shirt pocket with the care of someone who needed something to do with his hands. Ray, the long-haul driver with the bad hip, looked at the floor. Bishop had gone very still. Dale Royce, Griff said. He said the name the way you say a name you have said before, flat and certain. Developer. Drives a gray Audi. Jean looked at him. You know him. We know him. Griff looked at Bishop. Something passed between them that Jean could not read entirely but understood in its general shape. Then Griff looked back at Jean. The old Hargrove place, he said. 2 roads over from my shop, other side of the ridge. Woman named Hattie Greer lived there. 78 years old. Been in that house since she was 39, raised her kids there, buried her husband there. Royce came to her with the same thing he's bringing you. Friendly first, reasonable offers. Then the letter started the legal-sounding ones full of language she couldn't read without a lawyer, and she couldn't afford a lawyer. Griff's jaw tightened. By the time it was over, she was out, moved in with her daughter over in Millhaven. There's a parking lot where her garden used to be. Jean listened. Marcus Webb, said the man with the reading glasses, whose name turned out to be Dex. Veteran, lost a leg overseas, was getting by on his disability, had a place down on Miller Street he'd owned free and clear for 20 years. Then the disability got cut back, and he fell behind on property taxes. He shook his head. Royce was on him before the ink was dry on the notice. Same playbook. Friendly visits, then not so friendly. Marcus held out longer than Hattie, but the end was the same. A murmur moved through the room, low and heavy, the sound of men who have been carrying something for a long time. Jean looked at these faces, these men he had been afraid of an hour ago, and saw in them something he recognized from his own mirror. The helplessness of watching something wrong happen to someone you know, and being unable to stop it because the wrong thing was staying just inside the edges of what the law could reach. He's been doing this for years, Bishop said. He was not looking at Jean now, but at a middle point in the air between them. Picking the ones who are alone, old grieving behind on their payments, the ones who don't have anyone reading the fine print for them. He paused. The ones who think they're the only one. The room was quiet. Jean felt the shape of what Bishop had just said settle over him. He had believed without examining the belief that his situation was his own, that Dale Royce had found him by some particular misfortune. He had never considered the possibility of a pattern. He had never considered that Hattie Greer and Marcus Webb and possibly others were each sitting in their own silence believing the same thing. The woman, Jean said. Hattie Greer. And the veteran, Marcus. Yeah, Griff said. I'd like to talk to them. Griff looked at him. Why? Because I need to hear what happened to them in their own words, Jean said slowly. He looked up. And because I think maybe they need to hear that they're not the only ones. Something moved through the room. Not agreement exactly, not yet, but attention. Bishop looked at Jean for a long moment. Then he reached under the bar and found a piece of paper and a pen and wrote two addresses in a large, deliberate hand and slid it across the bar. The next morning, Jean called Court Halsey again. He still had no truck, still no way to get himself anywhere under his own power. Court came without question, same as before, with his thermos and his easy manner, and Jean gave him the first address, and they drove. Hattie Greer lived in a two-bedroom apartment in Millhaven, the next town over, in a building that was clean and well-maintained, and was not the house on the ridge where she had lived for 39 years and raised her children. She answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, a small woman with white hair and dark eyes, and the posture of someone who had once stood straighter and still carried the memory of it in her spine. She did not know why Jean was there. He had not called ahead because he did not have her number and had not thought to ask Bishop for it. He introduced himself through the door and told her he was a neighbor of sorts from over the county line on Route 9, and that he had heard about what had happened to her and thought maybe they had something in common. She studied him through the gap in the door for a moment with the wariness of a woman who has learned the hard way about men who show up unannounced, and then she opened it. They sat at her kitchen table and she told him. He listened the way he had always listened to things that mattered completely, not thinking about what he would say next, just taking in what was being said. She was not a dramatic storyteller. She told it plainly, the way you tell something that happened to you in the order it happened, with the specific details that stick because they stuck. The first visit from Royce, his card, his handshake, his pleasant talk about the changing market and what a place like hers might be worth to the right buyer. The second visit, when the offer was formalized into something that looked official, full of numbers that seemed significant until you understood them. The letters that came after she declined, each one a little more formal and legal sounding, until she was afraid to open her mailbox. And the thing that undid her, the thing she told Jean in a voice that was even and quiet and cost her something, was not the legal maneuvering. It was one specific letter dated May 2019, in which Dale Royce's office had written to her about a right of first refusal clause in language that made her believe she had missed a deadline she had in fact not missed, because the deadline stated in that letter was not the deadline the law required. I didn't know that then, she said. I just knew I was scared. I signed what they put in front of me because I was scared and alone, and I didn't understand any of it. And by the time my daughter drove up from Millhaven to look at the papers, it was too late. Jean asked her if she still had the letter. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to a box on the shelf above the small desk in the corner, sorted through it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who keeps everything, and drew out a letter in a plastic sleeve and set it on the table in front of him. He read it carefully. He was not a lawyer and did not know the specific language of real estate law. But he had spent 40 years reading technical documents, engine manuals, and repair specifications and compliance materials, and he knew the shape of a thing intended to mislead. He folded the letter back into its sleeve and asked Hattie if he could photograph it with his phone. She said yes. He asked if she would be willing to tell her story to someone else officially if it came to that. She looked at him for a long moment. Would it help somebody else keep their house? I think it might, he said. Then yes, she said. They drove from Millhaven to Miller Street, Jean and Court, and Jean went to Marcus Webb's door while Court stayed in the truck. Marcus Webb was 64, a man who had left a leg overseas and come home and built a life on the terms available to him, which were harder terms than most. He was sitting in a chair near the window when Jean arrived, not the chair of a man who had given up, but the chair of a man who was conserving what he had. And he listened to Jean's introduction with a stillness that was different from Hattie's wariness. It was the stillness of a man who has made a professional study of measuring threats. He told his story in fewer words than Hattie. The property taxes the notice Royce's arrival within what seemed like days of that notice appearing in the public record. The escalation from friendly to not friendly. He had held out for 8 months before the combination of legal pressure and dwindling resources made holding out impossible. He too had documents. He too had a letter with language that did not say what the law required it to say. Gene sat in Marcus Webb's apartment and looked at the letter and felt something crystallize in him, something that had been moving toward a point since he had sat at his kitchen table 3 days ago with a stranger's wallet and a choice to make. He opened the small notebook he had brought with him. Eleanor had given it to him the previous Christmas, one of the last gifts, a small green notebook with his initials on the cover. He had not used it yet. He used it now, writing in the careful hand of a man who had always taken notes to be read later. He wrote down what Hattie had told him. He wrote down what Marcus had told him. He wrote the dates, the names, the specific details of the letters, and what they had said and what the law apparently required them to say. He wrote it down in Eleanor's notebook, which was the only appropriate place for it. When he was done, he thanked Marcus Webb, who shook his hand at the door with the grip of a man who has kept himself strong because strength is what he has. And Gene walked back to Court's truck in the gray November afternoon with the notebook in his coat pocket and a photograph on his phone and the beginning of something that might be enough. The meeting at the clubhouse 2 days later was not something Gene had organized exactly. He had called Bishop, which had required some negotiation with the universe, since he did not have Bishop's number. But Griff Bauer's shop was on Route 12, and Gene had walked to it on his sore knees the morning after visiting Hattie and Marcus, and Griff had given him a number. Bishop had said to come Thursday evening. Gene had asked Court again, and Court had asked even fewer questions this time. The lawyer's name was Philip Strand. He was Griff's brother-in-law, which Gene had not known, and Bishop apparently had, and he arrived at the clubhouse in a car that was slightly too clean for the parking lot and a coat that was slightly too pressed. But he sat down at the scarred table with his briefcase and opened it without ceremony, and Gene could tell within the first 5 minutes of watching him work that he was genuinely good at this. Gene laid out what he had: the notices from Royce's office, the foreclosure timeline, the letters with their carefully misleading language, then the photographs from his phone, the letter to Hattie and the letter to Marcus, both of them. Philip Strand read everything. He read it with a quality of attention that was almost aggressive, leaning forward, going back to things, making small notations on his yellow legal pad. The room waited. Bishop sat at the end of the table with his coffee and watched the lawyer work. When Strand looked up, his face was not what Gene had hoped to see. "Royce has been careful," Strand said. He set his pen down. "The notices he sent you are technically compliant. The offers are lowball but not legally actionable. The pressure campaign is unpleasant, but it stays just inside the line." He paused. "If all we have is your situation, this is going to be difficult." The room absorbed that. Gene looked down at the table. He had known this was possible. He had walked out to Hattie Greer's apartment and Marcus Webb's chair by the window, knowing it might come to nothing, knowing that being right about a man's character and being able to prove his wrongdoing are not the same thing. He sat with that for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out Eleanor's notebook, opened it on the table, found the page he wanted and turned it so Philip Strand could see it. "This is from Hattie Greer's letter," he said. He put his finger on the line. "May 2019. Royce's office told her she had 30 days from the date of the offer to exercise her right of first refusal. She was told she had missed that window." Strand looked at the page. He looked at the photograph on Gene's phone that Gene slid across to him, the original letter in its plastic sleeve. "The statutory period in this state for right of first refusal notification," Gene said slowly, because he had looked this up on his phone in Court's truck on the way back from Millhaven and read it 3 times to be certain, "is 45 days, not 30. Philip Strand looked at the letter. He looked at Gene. He looked back at the letter. He picked up his pen. "She was told 30 days. Strand said, his voice careful. "Yes, and she missed the 30-day window, which means she did not miss the actual legal window." Gene paused. "She signed papers she didn't have to sign because she was told she had already run out of time. And she hadn't." The room was very quiet. Strand was reading the letter again more slowly, and Jean watched the quality of his attention change the forward lean, becoming something more engaged, his pen beginning to move. Marcus Webb's letter, Jean said, has a different issue. Similar outcome. He turned a page in the notebook. Strand read that too. When he set his pen down the second time, his expression was different. These are not mistakes, Strand said. The misstatement in the Greer letter is too specific to be accidental. 30 days versus 45 is not a typo. And if the Webb letter shows a similar pattern of misrepresentation to induce a signature under false pretense, then we are talking about something considerably more serious than predatory business practice. He looked at Jean. Where did you get these? I went and listened to the people it happened to, Jean said. Strand looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Bishop, and Bishop looked at Jean, and neither of them said anything. I need the originals, Strand said, and I need Hattie Greer and Marcus Webb willing to provide sworn statements. He was already writing. And I need to know if there are others. Jean thought about what Bishop had said, that Royce had been doing this for years, picking the ones who were alone, the ones who thought they were the only one. There may be others, Jean said. I can try to find them. Strand nodded once. Find them, he said. It was late by the time Court dropped Jean at his door. The night had gone cold, the kind of cold that settles in for good when November turns the corner, and Jean's breath was visible in the beam of Court's headlights as he climbed down and said goodnight. He stood in his driveway for a moment before going in. The truck sat on its blocks in the dark, same as it had been for 2 months. The house was dark the way it was always dark when he came home now. No light in the kitchen window, no sound from inside. For 18 months, every homecoming had that quality, the specific silence of a house with one person fewer in it than it should have. He went inside. He made tea because it was too late for coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it for a while. Dale Royce's latest letter was on the counter where Jean had put it when it arrived. He had not moved it because he needed to know exactly where a dangerous thing was. The deadline it contained was 9 days away. Jean picked up Eleanor's notebook and turned to a clean page. He wrote the word others at the top, and under it began to write the names of people he might ask, people he knew slightly or by reputation who were in situations similar to his. Old, alone, behind. The kind of people Dale Royce looked for. He wrote for a while. He looked at the list when he was done. It was a beginning. He thought about Hattie Greer in her apartment in Millhaven, looking out a window that was not her window. He thought about Marcus Webb by his window on Miller Street, the stillness of a man who has given and lost more than most and is still here. He thought about Riley Merritt's big unguarded grin in a photograph worn soft from being looked at 1,000 times. He thought about Eleanor, who had held his hand near the end and made him promise to stay the man she had married no matter what it cost. He closed the notebook. He put the pen down. Tomorrow he would call Court again. Tomorrow there were more doors to knock on, more people to listen to, more pages, to fill in a small green notebook with his initials on the cover. Tonight he sat at his kitchen table in his quiet house and let himself feel the exhaustion of a man who has been doing something alone for a long time and has just discovered with a surprise he could not quite account for, that he is not as alone as he believed. The letter from Dale Royce's attorney arrived on a Wednesday morning, 9 days before the deadline on the foreclosure notice. Jean found it in the mailbox at the end of his driveway, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery circular. The way terrible things sometimes arrive quietly without ceremony, as if they are ordinary. The envelope had a law firm's name in the upper left corner. Whitfield and Associates, the kind of name designed to sound like weight and authority, and Jean stood at the end of his driveway in the cold morning air and looked at it for a moment before he opened it. He read it twice, standing there, his breath making small clouds. The letter informed Eugene Calloway that his client Dale Royce was pursuing legal action against Mr. Calloway for the unlawful retention of personal property, specifically a wallet and its contents belonging to Mr. Royce's associate, and that said retention constituted civil theft under applicable state statutes. It further informed Mr. Calloway that should he wish to avoid the filing of formal charges, he might consider resolving the outstanding matter of his delinquent mortgage payments through the mechanism of the standing offer previously extended by Mr. Royce, which remained on the table for the next 72 hours, after which it would be withdrawn permanently. Gene read that paragraph a second time to be certain he had understood it. Dale Royce was threatening to sue him over the wallet he had returned. He stood at the end of his driveway and looked at that letter for a long moment. He understood what he was looking at. It was not a real lawsuit. No lawyer worth the name would bring a civil theft case over a wallet that had already been returned to its owner, and whoever Whitfield and Associates were, they knew that too. This was pressure. This was Royce understanding that something had changed, that the old man on Route 9 had stopped being the passive, isolated target the plan required, and responding the only way he knew how, by escalating, by making the cost of resistance look higher than the cost of giving in, by trying to make Gene feel alone again. He walked back to the house with the letter in his hand and sat down at the kitchen table. The morning light came through the window at its particular angle. The coffee mug on the second shelf caught a piece of that light. He did not call Bishop. He sat with the letter and his coffee in the quiet of the house and thought the way he had always thought through hard problems methodically from the outside in. He thought about what Royce was doing and why he was doing it now. He thought about the timing, 9 days before the foreclosure deadline, 72 hours before the offer was withdrawn, the numbers calculated to produce a specific feeling in the chest of a 71-year-old man sitting alone in a house he was about to lose. He thought about Eleanor. Not the end, not the hospital, in the long, terrible diminishment of it. He thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table in the years before the way she had been in her full strength, which was considerable. Eleanor, who had been the one when they were young and first married and money was tight, the way young people's money is tight, who had looked at a late notice from the power company and said, "We are going to deal with this," and had dealt with it. Eleanor, who did not panic because she believed panicking was a form of cooperation with the problem. "Stay the man I married," she had said. Gene looked at the letter from Whitfield and Associates. He thought about what the man she had married would do. Then he picked up his phone and called Court Halsey. Court came without questions, same as every time, and they drove first to Millhaven. Gene had called Hattie Greer the night before, had gotten her number from Philip Strand, who had been in contact with her about her sworn statement, and she was expecting him. She opened the door in the same cardigan as the first visit and had coffee already made, and Gene sat down at her kitchen table and told her what Royce had done. She listened with the stillness of a woman who has heard bad news before and knows how to receive it without being knocked over. "He's scared," she said when Gene finished. "I think so," Gene said. "Scared men do stupid things," she said. "My husband Bernard used to say that. He was right about most things." Gene told her what he needed, not as a favor, but the way one person tells another what the situation requires. He told her that Philip Strand had the letter, the one with the falsified deadline, and that Strand believed it was actionable, but that actionable required her willingness to stand behind her statement officially and publicly if it came to that. Hattie Greer looked at him across her kitchen table. This small woman in her cardigan in an apartment that was not her home, with a window that looked out on a parking lot that had once been a garden. "I've been sitting in this apartment for 14 months, she said, thinking about what I should have done differently, what I should have said, who I should have called. She folded her hands on the table. "Yes, I'll stand behind it." Gene wrote that down in Eleanor's notebook. They drove from Millhaven to Miller Street, and Marcus Webb answered the door before Gene could knock twice, as if he had heard the truck and been ready. Gene told him the same things he had told Hattie. Marcus listened the same way he had listened the first time, with the evaluating stillness of a man who has made a career of assessing situations quickly. "Royce is moving because he's losing ground," Marcus said. "That's what this is. That's what Philip Strand thinks. Philip Strand is right." Marcus looked past Gene toward Court's truck idling at the curb, then back. "You need me there when it happens." "I don't know yet what's going to happen," Gene said honestly. "When you know, Marcus said you call me." Gene wrote that down too. That afternoon, sitting at his kitchen table with Eleanor's notebook open and his phone beside it, Gene made 6 calls. He had spent the previous week after the evening at the clubhouse with Philip Strand following the names on the list he had made, the people he thought might be Royce's other targets. 3 of those calls went nowhere. disconnected numbers, or people who did not want to talk about it, which Jean understood and did not push. But three of them talked. A woman named Vera Schofield, 73, who had been pressured out of a property on the eastern edge of the county and had signed under circumstances she now described as feeling trapped. She had a letter, too, with language that did not match what the statute required. A man named Lowell Pruitt, 68, a retired school teacher who had managed to hold on to his property but had documents from Royce's office that Strand needed to see. A widow named Carol Betts, 76, who burst into tears on the phone when Jean told her that other people had had the same experience because she had believed for 2 years that she was the only one. He wrote all of it in Eleanor's notebook. Then he called Philip Strand. Strand listened without interrupting, which Jean had come to understand was his method. When Jean finished, there was a brief silence on the line. How many individuals with documentation of misrepresented deadlines or statutory requirements? Strand said. 3 confirmed, Jean said. Possibly more. I need them. Signed statements, original documents where possible, photographs where not. How fast can you move? Jean thought about Court's truck and his knees and the fact that he was running out of days. Fast enough, he said. Jean. Strand's voice changed slightly more direct. What Royce did in that letter to you, the civil theft threat, it's empty. No court is going to entertain a theft claim on a wallet that was returned to its owner. He knows that. It's a pressure tactic. A pause. But you should know he's going to escalate before he backs down. That's the pattern with people like this. They push hardest right before they give up. I know, Jean said. You sure? I spent 40 years working on engines, Jean said. Something's always loudest right before it fails. There was a pause, and then Philip Strand did something Jean had not heard him do before. He laughed a short, real sound. All right, he said. Get me what you have. Jean spent the next 3 days moving. Court drove him without complaint, and Jean sat in that truck making calls and taking notes and accumulating the documentary evidence of Dale Royce's long, quiet campaign, the letters and the false deadlines, and the pressure that walked just inside the legal line until it did not. He went back to Vera Schofield in her small house on the Eastern County Road and sat at her table and photographed every document she had. He went to Lowell Pruitt's house and came away with a folder of originals that Pruitt had kept in a file box in his closet because he was a teacher and teachers keep records of everything. He drove all of it to Philip Strand's office on Cedar Street, and Strand's assistant copied everything while Jean sat in a chair in the waiting area and drank water and felt his joints stage their usual protest. On the way home, sitting in Court's truck, as the afternoon light went thin and gold across the fields of Route 9, Jean said, I appreciate this, the driving. Court was quiet for a moment watching the road. 40 years ago, he said finally, my father was losing his business. Small grocery on the north side of town. Landlord was jacking the rent to push him out, wanted the property for something else. He did not look at Jean. A man in that neighborhood, a man my father barely knew, spent a week going around to every business owner on that street getting them to sign a letter to the city council. Landlord backed off. Another pause. Father always said he never knew why the man did it. Never got a chance to ask him. Jean looked at the road ahead of them. Court, he said. Don't, Court said not unkindly. Just let me drive. Jean let him drive. Philip Strand filed the complaint with the State Attorney General's office 4 days before the deadline. 3 confirmed instances of misrepresented statutory timelines in Dale Royce's correspondence with documentation and sworn statements. It was not a criminal filing, not yet, but it was the kind of filing that goes on a record and opens an investigation and makes a name mean something different than it meant the week before. Strand also sent a letter to Whitfield and Associates laying out the documentation and its implications in the careful language of a man who has done this before and is good at it. Royce did not respond. The morning of the deadline came the way mornings come, whether you are ready for them or not, gray and cold. The November light thin and early over the fields of Route 9. Jean had slept, which surprised him. He had been more tired than worried, the deep tiredness of a body that has been moving hard for a week. and he had slept well and woken early with a clarity that felt almost like calm. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come up over the back field, the same light Eleanor had always loved, and he drank his coffee and thought about the sequence of things. He rinsed his cup and set it on the counter beside Eleanor's mug. He put on his coat. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Hattie Greer was sitting in a lawn chair at the foot of his porch steps. She was wearing a heavy coat and a wool hat, and she had a thermos in her hands, and she looked up at Jean with an expression that said she had been there a while and had no intention of going anywhere. "I brought coffee," she said. "The real kind. Not that gas station stuff." Jean looked out past her at the road. Marcus Webb was standing at the edge of Jean's property, leaning on the cane he used on cold days, when the phantom limb made itself known as coat buttoned to the throat, watching the end of the driveway with the patient attention of a man who has pulled long watches before. Beyond Marcus at the fence line, a row of motorcycles. Jean counted them without meaning to. 11. Parked in that particular alignment, precise and deliberate chrome, catching the thin morning light. The men beside them stood with their arms crossed or their hands in their jacket pockets, some talking quietly, most watching the road. Bishop was at the end of the line, not the middle, not the front. Just there, a large still presence in his colors, his eyes on the end of the driveway. Lowell Pruitt was on the sidewalk across the road with a woman Jean did not know. Vera Schofield was there in a long coat, and Carol Betts beside her. Carol was already crying not from sadness, but from what Jean recognized as the relief of people finding each other in a room where they had thought they were alone. The neighbors were on their porches. Jean had not told them to come. He had not called anyone except Strand and Hattie and Marcus. He had not organized this. He did not know exactly how it had happened, the way information travels in a neighborhood when the subject is a neighbor under threat, but they were there. Ed Maples from the property on the east side standing with his wife on their porch steps. The Farrell family 2 houses down. Old June Prentice across the road, who Jean had spoken to maybe 6 times in 30 years, standing at her mailbox with her hands folded. And at the end of the driveway, Philip Strand. He had parked a block down and walked, and he stood on Jean's front walk with his briefcase in one hand and a file folder under his arm, in a pleasant, unremarkable expression that promised a considerable amount of paperwork. Jean stood on his porch and looked at all of it. He thought about walking across a gravel lot toward a door he was afraid of. He thought about what a single, honest choice sends out into the world, the rings that move from a stone dropped in still water, widening out past what you can see from where you're standing. He walked down his porch steps and crossed to where Hattie was sitting, and she looked up at him and held out the thermos. "It's cold," she said. "Drink something." He poured a cup and drank it, standing there beside her, the two of them watching the road. The gray Audi appeared at the end of the street at 8:43 in the morning. It came slowly, the way a car comes when its driver is reading the situation as he approaches, and the situation was not what Dale Royce had anticipated. Jean watched the car slow further as it came down the street, watched it register the motorcycles, register the people on the porches, and the sidewalk register the small crowd at the foot of Jean's drive. The car did not stop. It rolled to the edge of Jean's property and idled there for a moment. Then the door opened and Dale Royce got out. Jean had seen him 3 times before at his own front door, and each time Royce had been the same well-dressed, pleasant face, the kind of man who has cultivated an appearance of reasonableness as a professional tool. Today he was in a dark overcoat, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and he looked at the assembled people on Jean's property with an expression that moved through several states. Quickly surprised calculation, something that might have been anger before it was controlled, and then settled into the flatness of a man who has decided to perform composure. He walked through the gate and up the front walk toward the porch where Jean was now standing, and the walk was not quite as steady as it was meant to appear. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Jean. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice was even. "I was hoping we could talk." "We are talking," Jean said. Royce glanced to his left where Hattie Greer was sitting in her lawn chair looking at him with complete calm. Something moved across his face at the sight of her, quickly controlled. This doesn't need to be complicated, Royce said. He brought his eyes back to Jean. You're a reasonable man. I'm a reasonable man. There's a straightforward path here that solves your problem and gives you a fresh start. The offer on the table is fair. It isn't, Jean said. Royce paused, a brief recalibration. The market out here, the offer is 40% below market, Jean said. You know that. I know that. The people behind me know that. He did not raise his voice. He was not angry, which was the thing he had understood clearly when he woke that morning with his unexpected calm. The time for feeling anything sharp about Dale Royce had passed. What he felt now was simpler and steadier than anger. The people behind me also know something else. Several of them have letters from your office with incorrect statutory timelines. Philip Strand has filed a complaint about those letters with the Attorney General's office. Royce's expression did not break, but something behind it did, some invisible support structure that had been holding the pleasant composure in place, and without it, the pleasantness looked like what it had always been. A surface. I don't know what you think you found, Royce said, but letters from my office go through legal review. The letter you sent Hattie Greer in May of 2019, Jean said, told her she had 30 days to exercise her right of first refusal. He paused. The statute requires 45. Silence. The street was very quiet. Somewhere down the block, a door had opened, and whoever it was had not gone back inside. She had 15 days left when she signed your papers, Jean said. She didn't know that. You did. Royce looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked out at the street, at the motorcycles along the fence, with their riders standing in the cold, at the neighbors on their porches, at Philip Strand, with his briefcase, at Hattie Greer in her lawn chair, and Marcus Webb with his cane. He looked at Carol Betts with her hands over her mouth, and Vera Schofield standing beside her. He looked at the photographer Jean had not noticed until this moment, a young woman with a camera on the sidewalk with the focused quality of someone doing a job. Jean did not know who had called the newspaper. He suspected Griff Bauer, who had a talent for logistics, but he had not asked. Royce looked at all of it, and Jean watched him understand what he was looking at. Not a problem he could solve, not a man he could isolate and outlast, a community. The thing that Royce's entire method depended on never materializing, because his strategy worked only on the premise that each target was alone and would remain alone. He was standing in the middle of its opposite. This is a business matter, Mr. Calloway, Royce said, and something had gone out of his voice, some certainty that had always been there before. It doesn't need to. With every person standing here, Jean said quietly, it's personal. The shutter of the camera clicked small and distinct in the quiet morning. Royce stood at the foot of the porch steps for another moment, and in that moment Jean saw something he had not expected to see. Not the predator recalculating, not the performer finding a new angle. Just a man who had run a strategy for years on the assumption that he would never be stopped by the people he targeted, because the people he targeted were old and alone and without resources, who was now standing in the evidence that he had been wrong in a way that was going to follow him. He turned. He walked back down the front walk through the gate to the gray Audi at the curb. He got in. He sat there for a moment, the car idling. Then he drove away. The street let out a sound after he was gone. Not a cheer exactly. More the collective exhale of people who have been holding their breath. A sound of pure relief that moved through the crowd and broke into voices and then laughter, the kind that comes when the weight lifts all at once. Hattie Greer stood up from her lawn chair and turned to Jean on the porch steps, and her face, which had been composed and certain all morning, was wet now, and she did not seem to mind. Marcus Webb unclenched his hand from the head of his cane and looked at Jean across the yard with an expression that did not need words. Carol Betts had stopped crying and was laughing instead, her hand still over her mouth. Philip Strand climbed the porch steps and stood beside Jean and said quietly, "The AG complaint is already in. Whitfield and Associates will advise their client to drop the foreclosure before end of week. They have no choice." He paused. "You did this." "A lot of people did this," Jean said. "A lot of people showed up because you gave them a reason to," Strand said. He was not a man who made speeches. He said it plainly and then went back down the steps to shake Marcus Webb's hand. Gene stood on his porch in the cold morning air and looked at the street at these people who had come out on a November morning to stand on his behalf at the motorcycles along the fence with their riders mounting up engines, starting one by one that sound Gene had come to know, low and purposeful and sure. Bishop caught his eye from the end of the line. He held Gene's gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once the same small nod as that first morning across the bar and put on his helmet and swung his leg over his machine. They went down the street in formation and turned at the end and were gone, the sound of them fading out along Route 9, the way sound fades in cold air, slowly leaving the quiet more complete than it had been before. Strand was right about the timeline. The formal withdrawal of the foreclosure came through on a Friday afternoon, 4 days after Royce's gray Audi had backed down Gene's street. Philip Strand called with the news in the same even tone he used for everything, as if he were reporting a weather pattern, and Gene thanked him, and after he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a while doing nothing in particular. The house was his. The house on Route 9 where he and Eleanor had lived for 40 years, where the light came through the kitchen window at its particular angle every morning, where the coffee mug on the second shelf caught that light and held it. He had told himself throughout that it was going to be his. But there is a difference between believing a thing and knowing it, and now he knew it, and the knowing settled into him like heat into cold ground, slowly all the way down. He sat with it for a while. He called his daughter in Colorado and talked to her for an hour, the longest they had spoken since Eleanor's funeral, and there were parts of the conversation that were hard and parts that were not. And at the end of it, she said she wanted to come visit in the spring, and Gene said he would like that very much. He called Court Halsey to say the truck was still broken and he would need a ride to the hardware store if Court was going that way. Court told him to stop asking and just call when he needed to go. On Saturday morning, Gene woke to the sound of engines. Not one engine, several. He lay in bed for a moment listening, and then he got up and pulled on his clothes and went to the front door and opened it. They were in his driveway. 7 of them, 8, with Griff Bauer's truck pulled up on the grass beside the drive. The bikes were parked along the fence in their usual alignment, and the men were in work clothes, not their colors, which Gene would understand later was a deliberate choice, a signal that this was not club business, but something more personal. Griff was already on his back under the truck with a light. 2 other men stood over the engine bay with the hood up. Another had the parts manifest spread out on the tailgate of Griff's truck. They had brought the throw-out bearing, they had brought the clutch kit, they had brought all of it, the right parts, for the right truck, which meant someone had looked up the make and model and year, and Gene stood on his porch in the cold morning air and took that fact in. Bishop was standing at the edge of the driveway, not working, just standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the activity around Gene's truck, the way a man watches something he organized. When Gene came down the porch steps, he turned. "Should be running by noon," Bishop said. Gene looked at his truck, at the men around it, their breath making small clouds in the cold, the easy efficiency of people who know what they are doing and are doing it together. "You didn't have to," Gene said. Bishop looked at him steadily. "You walked 20 miles to give a man back his wallet," he said, "his money and his boy's picture. You didn't have to do that either." Gene had nothing to say to that. He stood beside Bishop and watched Griff work. "How's it coming?" he called under the truck. "Coming fine," Griff's voice said, slightly muffled. "Your clutch cable is also shot, by the way. Good thing we brought one." "I see you did." "I saw what I saw." Gene almost smiled. They worked through the morning, the kind of work that has its own rhythm, the back and forth of men who know their tools, the conversation moving around the task without ever losing the task. Gene made coffee and brought it out, and then found himself on his back on the cold concrete with a light in his hand, doing what his hands knew how to do, because he could not stand and watch men work on his truck without working too. They moved to make room for him, as if he had been expected. At 20 minutes before noon, Griff Bauer slid out from under the truck and wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Gene with the expression mechanics wear when the thing that was broken is not broken anymore. "Go on," Griff said. He held out the keys. Gene took them. He stood beside the truck for a moment. The keys were cold in his hand, the specific, familiar weight of them. He opened the driver's door. The smell of the cab, the accumulated smell of a truck that belongs to one person, and only one person, hit him as he climbed in, and he sat behind the wheel for the first time in 63 days and put both hands on it and felt the shape of it. He put the key in. Everyone had stopped working. They were all watching, not making anything of it, just there the way people are there for a thing that matters. Gene turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and caught, and the old diesel found its voice, that deep, particular thrum Gene had known for 20 years, strong and clean and running right. He sat behind the wheel of his truck with both hands on it and his eyes closed, and everything he had been holding for 63 days, in 18 months, in 2 years of fighting and loss, came up all at once, the way it comes when the thing you have been holding on for finally arrives and the holding is over. He put his head down on his hands on the steering wheel and he wept, not quietly, the kind of crying a man does when he has not done it for a long time, and his body has more in it than he knew. Deep and ungoverned, the crying of grief and exhaustion and relief all arriving together. He wept for Eleanor and the garden and the coffee mug and 40 years of the light through the kitchen window and the weight of her hand near the end. He wept for 63 mornings on aching knees on Route 9 and the letters in their envelopes and the long solitude of a house with one person fewer in it than it should. He wept because the engine was running and the truck was fixed, and he was not going to lose his home, and it had cost him nothing but the choice to be the man Eleanor believed him to be. The men stood in the cold driveway and let him. No one spoke. No one moved away. They stood in the thin November sunlight and let Gene Calloway feel the thing all the way through, the way you let a friend feel a thing when there is nothing else to do and nothing else that would help. After a while, the crying stopped, the way it stops when it has done what it came to do. Gene lifted his head and looked through the windshield at the driveway and the fence and the road beyond. He took a breath. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He got out of the truck. Nobody said anything, which was right. Griff handed him a cup of coffee and Gene took it, and the morning went on around them. That evening, Bishop came back alone after the others had gone and sat on Gene's porch in the cold. Gene brought 2 cups of coffee and they sat without talking for a while, which was something Gene had found he could do with Bishop in a way he could not do with most people. Sit in a silence that was comfortable rather than empty. The last light was going off the fields west of the road, the sky turning from gray to that deep blue that comes just before dark. "I want to ask you something," Bishop said. He was looking at the road. "And I want the honest answer, not the one that sounds good." "All right," Gene said. "Why did you bring it back?" Bishop said. "The real reason. You were 9 days from losing this house. That money would have covered it. Nobody in the world would have known. So why?" Gene looked out at the road and was quiet for a moment. "I thought about keeping it," he said. "I want you to know that. I sat at that table for 3 days and I thought about it hard. I turned it every way I could think to turn it." He paused. "I had arguments. Good ones. I could have told myself you didn't need it the way I needed it. I could have told myself I had earned it somehow, finding it going to the trouble. I had arguments." "So what stopped you?" Bishop said. Gene was quiet for a moment longer. "Near the end," he said, "when Ellie knew where things were headed, she got hold of my hand one night in the hospital. She was so small by then. She'd been a strong woman her whole life, and the illness had taken most of that, and she was small, and she held my hand, and she told me it was going to get hard, that it would be harder than I knew. And she made me promise that whatever happened, I would stay the man she married, that I wouldn't let the hard turn me into someone she wouldn't recognize." He stopped. The light was almost gone from the fields now. "I promised her," he said. "And then she was gone, and the bills came, and the house started slipping, and Roy started showing up, and every day after that, the promise got a little harder to keep, because the hard was exactly as hard as she said it would be." He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands. "And then I found your wallet," he said, "and I sat there with all that money and I understood something. If I kept it, I'd save the house. but I'd lose the things she made me promise to protect, the man she knew, the man she believed I was. He paused, and that was the one thing Royce couldn't take from me, the one thing nobody could take unless I gave it away myself. He looked at Bishop. I gave the money back, he said, because if I'd kept it, I'd have lost her twice. The porch was quiet. The last light was gone from the sky, the blue deepening toward dark, the first stars faint and far above the tree line. The road was empty in both directions. Bishop reached into his vest and drew out the photograph, the small, worn picture of Riley in the sunlit yard, and held it in both hands, looking at it in the failing light. I've been carrying this for 3 years, he said. Everywhere I go, every day. He ran his thumb along the edge of it. People in the club know about Riley, but I don't talk about him. Not really. Not the way you need to talk about someone to keep them real. He paused. I stopped knowing how. Jean looked at the photograph at the young man's unguarded grin. He looks like you, Jean said. The eyes. Everybody said that, Bishop said, and something shifted in his voice at the past tense. He had his mother's mouth, though, always smiling. What was he like, Jean said, and Bishop talked. He talked about Riley the way you talk when you have been not talking about someone for a long time, and the words have been building up behind the silence. He talked about the boy at 10 and the boy at 17, and the young man he had become, the dark eyes and the quick laugh, and the way he had of making everyone in a room feel like they were the only one he'd come to see. He talked about the arguments they had had over the years when Riley kept his distance from the club, and Bishop tried to understand that and had not always managed to. He talked about the reconciliation in the last year, the Saturday afternoons in the shop, the conversations that were starting to go somewhere real. He talked about the accident, the road and the rain and the phone call. He talked about standing at a grave with a number on it instead of a name because the money was never quite all there at once. Jean listened the whole way through, completely not thinking about what he would say, just taking in what was being said. When Bishop stopped talking, the night had settled fully around them, the porch in the dark, the stars out in force above the empty fields of Route 9. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Jean said. He was, Bishop said. He was exactly that. They sat in the dark for a while longer. Two men on a porch at the end of a long road, each of them carrying someone who was gone. Each of them knowing now that the other understood the weight of it, not in the approximate way of sympathy, but in the exact way of shared experience. The kind of understanding that cannot be explained to someone who has not been there and does not need to be explained to someone who has. Jean thought about Eleanor in the kitchen in the morning light. He thought about the promise he had kept on sore knees across 63 days of gravel road, through letters and lawyers, and one cold morning on a doorstep he had been afraid of. He thought about how a wallet found in the frost had led him here to this porch, to this conversation, to this man who had opened a door he was not obligated to open and invited in an old man he had no reason to trust. He thought about the rings that move out from a single stone, dropped in still water widening past what you can see from where you're standing. Bishop, he said. Wade, the big man said. Out here, it's Wade. Jean looked at him. Wade, he said. Bishop, who was Wade out here in the dark, looked over at him. Thank you, Jean said. Not for the truck or the lawyer or the morning on the street when the motorcycles lined up along the fence without being asked. For all of it, but more than all of it. For the thing underneath all of it. Wade Merritt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back out at the road. Riley would have liked you, he said. He had a sense for people. Eleanor would have liked you, Jean said. She had one too. The road stretched out before them in the dark Route 9, going east and west through the cold November night. The same road where a wallet had appeared in the frost on a Thursday morning and a 71-year-old man had bent down on aching knees to pick it up and then sat for 3 days deciding what to do with it. The same road Gene Calloway would drive tomorrow morning for the first time in 63 days, in a truck that ran clean and strong because men he had been afraid of had shown up in his driveway on a Saturday morning with the right parts in their own hands. He sat with Wade Merritt in the dark and drank the last of his coffee and felt the specific hard-earned weight of a life that was still his, still whole, still worth the trouble of showing up for every morning on whatever terms the morning offered. The stars came out one by one above the fields of Route 9, cold and clear and very far away, and the two men sat beneath them in a silence that needed nothing added to it, each of them a little less alone in the world than they had been the morning that wallet turned up in the gravel.